Daniel Brooks had always trusted the coast. For 62 years he walked its edges, photographed its birds, and listened to the soft pull of the tide as if it were an old companion. But on that cold November afternoon, the ocean wasn't a companion. It was a force quietly reclaiming the land beneath his feet. He stepped off the boardwalk for just a moment, only long enough to get a clearer angle of a heron standing near the reeds. The ground looked solid, a thin layer of grass, firm enough to hold his weight. But tidal mud doesn't show its teeth until it has you. Daniel's right foot sank first, just an inch, then 2. He shifted his weight to pull it free, and the mud seized his boot like a closing fist. He tried the left foot. Nothing. Both legs were locked, swallowed past the ankles. A cold pulse ran up through the mud into his bones. He exhaled, frustrated. Not now. But when he turned to look back at the boardwalk, he saw something worse. The tide was already moving in. Thin streams of water pushed across the marsh, weaving between the reeds with growing confidence. He must have misread the tide chart, or maybe the weather had changed it. Either way, the ocean didn't care. Daniel leaned forward, trying to shift his weight, but the mud only tightened. He pulled harder. His muscles trembled. The water crept closer. This wasn't quicksand. This was something far more dangerous. Mud that didn't let go until the tide rose high enough to finish the job. Daniel swallowed hard as the first wavelets touched the ground around him. If he didn't get out soon, the ocean would decide the rest. Before we continue, tell me from which city you're watching this and what time it is there right now. I always like to know how far these stories travel. Daniel Brooks had never considered himself fragile. Not at 62, not after 2 knee surgeries, and not after a lifetime of walking coastal trails that younger hikers often avoided. He wasn't fast anymore, and he wasn't strong in the way he used to be, but he was steady, reliable, a man who knew his limits and respected them. That morning he had woken up with the kind of restlessness that only quiet places could fix. His daughter, Emily, had offered to join him, but he insisted on going alone. She worried too much, he thought. Worried because he lived alone. Worried because he didn't answer texts fast enough. Worried because she thought 62 meant he shouldn't go anywhere without someone holding his elbow. He hated that feeling, so he drove to the tidal marsh, a place he had visited dozens of times over the years. The air was cold, but not punishing. The skies were grey, but rain wasn't expected. The marsh was calm, empty, peaceful. A perfect place to take photos, clear his head and feel like himself again. He carried only the basics, his camera, a thermos of coffee, a small backpack, and the confidence that nothing out here could truly hurt him. Not anymore. Not at his age. He walked slowly along the wooden boardwalk, listening to the soft creaking of the planks under his boots. He stopped when he saw a great blue heron standing perfectly still in the reeds, a silhouette he'd photographed many times, but never from this angle. Just a few steps off the boardwalk, he told himself, just enough to get a better shot. He had stepped off the trail before 100 times, but today the mud was different, thicker, hungrier, and as the tide began its silent approach, Daniel realized far too late that this was the kind of mistake people didn't get to make twice. The first thing Daniel noticed was the temperature. The mud wasn't just wet, it was cold in a way that felt personal. It slid past his socks, pressed against his skin, and wrapped around his calves like a slow, tightening band of ice. Every small movement pushed that cold deeper into his legs, as if the marsh were quietly reminding him who was in control. He tried to treat it like information, not a verdict. "Okay," he muttered. "You've gotten out of worse." That wasn't really true. But at 62, he had learned that sometimes you said things just to keep your own mind from turning on you. He planted his hands on his thighs, leaned forward, and tried to pull his right foot up. The mud resisted with a thick, rubbery suction, a few centimeters, no more. His muscles trembled and a line of pain shot through his lower back. He exhaled and tried the left foot. Nothing. Both legs were swallowed past the ankles now, maybe deeper. The marsh had him. He turned his head. The boardwalk stood not far behind, a thin wooden strip that suddenly looked more like a boundary than a path. 20 steps, maybe less. 20 steps he couldn't take. He forced his eyes away from it and looked toward the water. It was closer than before. The tide crept in with quiet confidence, threading itself between clumps of grass, filling shallow depressions with a bright, reflective sheen. It didn't roar or crash. There was no drama, no wave, just water arriving. Daniel checked his watch and did the math again. He'd read the tide chart at the kitchen table that morning, glasses low on his nose, coffee cooling at his elbow. He'd given himself what he thought was a generous margin. The ocean, apparently, had not agreed. Wind brushed the side of his face, colder now, carrying the sharp salt smell he'd loved since childhood. It didn't feel nostalgic anymore. It felt like a reminder. He swallowed and tried again. Hands on his thighs. Deep breath. Pull. His right leg fought upward, then sank back with a wet, ugly sound. The mud tightened as if offended by the attempt. "Damn it!" he hissed. His voice sounded thin in the open air, swallowed by distance. He hesitated, then lifted his head and shouted, "Hey! Anyone out there?" The call stretched across the marsh, then dissolved. No answering voice, no footsteps on wood, no car door slamming where he couldn't see. He took another breath, deeper this time. "Help! Over here!" Nothing. The silence after his own voice faded was heavier than the mud. Alone then. He slid the strap of his backpack off his shoulder with care, fighting the awkward angle. The movement made the mud shift higher around his calves. He grunted, held his balance, and pulled the pack around to his side. Inside, rain jacket, thermos, binoculars, a granola bar, a small first aid kit, and his phone. Relief flickered. He wiped his fingers on his jacket, unlocked the screen, and looked at the corner. No signal, not one bar. Just his reflection staring back at him in the glass, eyes wider than before. He tried anyway. Emily. Then emergency services. Each call failed almost before his thumb left the screen. He held the phone a second longer, then put it back. "Should have remembered that," he muttered. Reception out here had always been spotty. He'd joked about it before. "Good place to disappear," he used to say. It didn't feel like a joke now. He took a careful sip of coffee from the thermos to steady his breathing. The bitter warmth was a small anchor. Think. The word came to him as sharply as if someone else had said it. He scanned the marsh again. Flat. Deceptive. No logs. No solid patches within reach. Just reeds, mud and water creeping closer. A memory surfaced of a documentary about bogs and soft ground. The narrator's voice had been calm. "Don't panic. Don't thrash. Spread your weight. Move slowly. Use your arms. Spread your weight." He looked at his legs, locked straight in the mud, then at the ground in front of him. "I don't have much to spread," he said aloud, but the idea stuck. He unrolled the rain jacket from his backpack and tossed it forward. It landed a short distance ahead, sagging but not immediately sinking. The fabric showed him where the mud might bear a little extra weight. Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward, bracing his palms on the wet surface. It felt unstable, but it held long enough for him to slide his upper body onto the jacket. The pressure on his legs lessened a fraction. His arms shook with the effort. His shoulders burned. But the new angle changed the way the mud gripped him. He tried a small, deliberate twist with his right foot. Not a kick. Not a yank. Just a slow rotation. The mud shifted. The suction didn't vanish, but it changed. The way a tight knot feels different the moment it begins to give. He twisted again, then paused to breathe. The water reached the edges of the ground around his boots now, lapping in soft, repetitive sounds. It wasn't high yet. It didn't need to be. All it had to do was keep rising while his body kept getting weaker. One thing at a time, he told himself. Free one leg, then the other. He twisted again and tried to slide his foot backward, not up. The mud resisted, then grudgingly allowed a few millimeters. His ankle throbbed. His calves pulsed. His fingers dug into the fabric beneath him. "Come on," he whispered. Another slide, another breath. His right heel moved within the boot. Sensation returned in odd, prickling bursts. His arms were starting to fail. They weren't used to holding so much of his weight. His chest hovered just above the jacket, every muscle in his upper body straining. He paused, cheeks close enough to the mud that he could smell it. Salt, rot, and something ancient. Emily's face flashed across his mind. She had stood in his doorway that morning, keys in hand, brows drawn. "Just text me when you get there," she'd said. "And when you leave, please." "I'll be fine," he'd replied. "It's a boardwalk, Em, not the Himalayas." He felt that sentence now like a stone in his throat. If he died here, it wouldn't be because the marsh was cruel. It would be because his pride had insisted he was still the same man who'd walked these places at 40 and 50. Not yet, he thought. He tightened his grip on the jacket and made one more calculated effort. A combined backward slide and upward pull with his right leg. The suction broke with a wet pop. His foot jerked inside the boot, twisting. For a second, he felt it come partially free, then jam hard against the stiff heel. The boot stayed where it was, buried. His socked foot bent at an ugly angle. The sudden release threw his balance off. His arms nearly buckled, and his face dropped toward the mud. He caught himself at the last instant, wrists screaming. Pain flared through his ankle, bright and electric. He gasped, teeth clenched. But his knee was no longer locked straight. His leg could bend. The mud still held the boot, but not the joint above it. It wasn't escape. Not yet. But it was the first real shift in his favor since the marsh had taken him. And just beyond his trapped left boot, the water kept inching higher, indifferent to how hard he was fighting to stay ahead of it. The pain in his ankle faded from sharp to dull, settling into a deep throbbing ache. Daniel let it sit there, a background hum he could ignore, and focused on the one fact that mattered. His right leg could bend now. The boot was still buried, but the joint was his again. He tested it carefully, drawing his knee toward his chest as far as the mud and twisted boot allowed. It was an awkward angle, but movement was movement. With each tiny retreat of his foot inside the boot, he was a little less welded to the marsh. Cold water lapped against his trapped left boot. The first touch wasn't much, a shallow ripple that barely covered the rubber, but it carried a message that cut deeper than the chill. Time is not on your side. He lifted his head. The water had spread wider, turning the once dry patches between grass clumps into a connected sheet of grey. The boardwalk seemed to float now. What had been a short walk was quickly becoming a crossing. He might not be able to make upright. "Focus," he whispered. He shifted more weight onto his forearms, trying to take pressure off his legs. His shoulders burned in protest, but the change in angle mattered. It gave him a few minutes before his muscles failed. He worked his right foot again, sliding it backward inside the boot in small increments. Each movement sent a fresh wave of pins and needles up his calf. The mud held the boot like a cast, but slowly, grudgingly, he felt his heel approach the opening. If he could get his foot out and leave the boot behind, he might at least free one leg. It was a trade, protection for mobility. Barefoot in mud meant less insulation, less grip, more risk of cuts. But a trapped leg was a guarantee. A bare foot was still a chance. He chose the chance. With a controlled, painful twist, he pulled his foot upward and backward one last time, picturing the exact shape of the boot. The rubber bit his skin, then slipped. His foot came free. Cold air hit his wet sock. His leg jerked, and he almost lost his balance. He dug his fingers into the rain jacket and mud, keeping his chest from dropping into the muck. His right leg from the knee down was clear. His foot hung in the mud rather than inside it. He pulled his knee closer until his thigh was near his chest, trying to keep the leg high, away from the strongest pull. The boot stayed behind, swallowed to the top. "One," he murmured. "One down." His arms shook harder. His wrists throbbed. The effort of holding himself up was draining him faster than he wanted to admit. The water climbed over his left boot, filling the space between mud and rubber. The cold bit straight through to his skin. He turned his attention there. The left leg was still pinned straight, the mud holding it as firmly as it had held the right. Now the tide added its own weight, softening the ground around the boot and turning every movement into a sloppy argument with the earth. He tried the same twisting motion. The suction felt stronger. Water swirled, turning the mud into a thick slurry that gave a little, then clamped down again. "Not this one," he whispered. "Not now." He twisted again, slower, remembering what had worked. tiny rotations, small backward slides, no jerks. Each effort sent dull pain through his knee and hip. Each pause brought more water around his shin. He glanced toward the boardwalk and imagined a car pulling in, someone stepping out, walking to the rail with a coffee in hand, noticing a man half submerged in the marsh. Depending on that felt like counting on a coin toss to save his life. Another voice echoed instead, his doctor's months earlier. "Falls and getting stuck," the man had said. "Those are the big ones now. Places where you're alone and can't get up. That's what worries me at your age." At your age. Out here, knee-deep in mud with the tide rising, the phrase didn't sound patronizing. It sounded like plain fact. His right arm slipped. His hand slid off the jacket and plunged into bare mud. His chest lurched downward, his face dipping close to the surface. Cold earth smeared across his cheek. Instinct made him drop his freed leg in search of balance. His bare foot instantly sank back into the mud, disappearing past the ankle. Panic flared. "No!" He yanked the leg up. The mud tried to hold it, but this time he didn't let it. His heart hammered as he dragged his foot free again, folding the knee and hugging it back toward his chest. His arms were nearly done. They shook with a wild, uncontrolled tremor. His fingers felt thick and numb. He needed a better angle. Slowly, he rotated his hips to the right, turning his body just enough that the pull on his left leg changed direction. Pain flared in his lower back, but the pressure on the trapped boot shifted. He tried another twist. This time the boot moved. Not far, just a fraction, but clearly. The mud's grip wasn't absolute. It could be convinced. Slowly. He twisted again, then paused to breathe. The water now wrapped halfway up his shin. His sock inside the boot felt like ice. He thought of Emily, her knocking on his door with groceries, her rolling her eyes when he refused help carrying them, the way she always checked the porch light on her way out. She would blame herself if he didn't come home. "Move," he growled at his own leg. He widened his hands on the jacket, spreading more weight forward, and tried a different tactic. Instead of pulling straight back, he slid his left foot in a small sideways arc, as if tracing a half circle inside the boot. The mud resisted, then grudgingly gave way. His calf cramped. He bit back a groan and rode it out. Slowly, space opened near his heel. Not much, but enough that he could feel it. He waited for the next little wave to pass, then committed. He pulled. His heel scraped against the inside of the boot. Wet fabric dragged across wet rubber. The boot gripped like a hand that didn't want to let go. "Let go," he gasped. With one last pull, his heel slipped free. His left foot tore out of the boot, burning with pins and needles as blood fought its way back. For a second, his whole body lurched, and he thought he would slide face first into the mud. He threw his freed leg up and out instead, folding his knee, dragging both bare feet closer beneath him. Now both boots stood like black stumps in the mud, empty and slowly vanishing. His feet, soaked and coated in muck, hovered above the worst of the suction, trembling with effort. He had freed his legs, but he wasn't safe, not even close. The water now wrapped around the abandoned boots, the level climbing with every passing minute. The boardwalk was still 20 impossible steps away across ground that could swallow him again if he moved wrong. His arms shook. His lungs burned. His whole body begged him to stop. But stopping meant staying exactly where the tide wanted him. And as Daniel held himself above the mud, he understood something he'd only ever said in theory before. The hardest part of survival wasn't always the danger itself. Sometimes it was the moment when your body was screaming enough, and you knew you had to keep going anyway. Have you ever been in a situation where your body was saying stop, but you had no choice but to keep going? Daniel's arms were giving out. Every second he stayed braced on the rain jacket felt like he was lifting his entire body with muscles that were 20 years past their prime. The tremors spreading through his shoulders were no longer warnings. They were the early signs of collapse. He needed a different position, something more stable, something that didn't rely on strength he no longer had. He shifted his weight to his elbows, lowering his chest onto the jacket. The new angle helped, just enough that he could pause without sinking again. His bare feet hovered above the mud, muddy, numb, and trembling. The cold bit through the soaked socks. He had maybe minutes before they stopped responding properly. He pushed his legs outward, spreading them slightly to widen his weight when he tried to move. It wasn't much, but every centimeter mattered. The water continued creeping in. It soaked the abandoned boots completely now, swirling around them until they looked like small islands. The surface shimmered under the grey sky, rippling closer with each shallow wave. He couldn't stay here. He needed to move forward, toward a patch of grass that looked firmer. Maybe if he could reach it, he could crawl the rest of the way. Maybe. He placed his left hand forward, testing the ground. His palm sank, but slowly. He pressed harder. It held, barely. He slid the rain jacket forward an inch at a time, using it like a makeshift sled. Every time he leaned on it, the fabric spread his weight enough to keep him from plunging in again. "Come on," he whispered. "Just keep it together." He pushed his body forward, slowly, carefully, keeping his legs bent to avoid letting his feet sink deep. The mud grabbed at his toes, but not as aggressively. Not with the same trapping force as before. A few feet, then a few more. His breathing turned ragged. Every movement felt like a negotiation with the ground, as if the marsh were deciding whether to tolerate him or swallow him again. He kept his weight low, chest and stomach pressed to the jacket, elbows and forearms taking the strain. His fingers were coated in black mud, slipping slightly every few movements, but he kept moving. For a moment, the water rushed around him faster than before. He froze, listening. A stronger wave? A shift in tide direction? A sign the water level had just passed some invisible threshold? He didn't know, and that uncertainty squeezed his throat, tighter than fear. He pushed again. The firm-looking patch of grass was closer, maybe 8 feet away now. 8 feet of crawling through mud that could grab him again at any moment. His right knee dipped too low and touched the surface, immediately sinking an inch. He jerked it back up, heart pounding. Not again. Not again. He shifted his hips, finding a slightly better angle, and resumed the crawl. His elbows stung from scraping across roots and grit. His right wrist trembled uncontrollably. His hands were numb. His chest was soaked, and the cold crept deeper under his jacket. But he kept moving, foot by foot. Another shallow wave rolled across the mud, brushing against his side. The tide was not waiting for him. It was rising faster than before, pulled by the moon and wind, indifferent to whether a 62-year-old man lived or died. Daniel clenched his teeth and pushed harder. The grassy patch was now just a few feet away, far enough that a younger man could have scrambled across, but at Daniel's age, with his body cold and depleted, it was still a challenge. He angled his elbows outward and dragged the jacket another half-foot, then pulled his torso onto it. His bare feet scraped against the mud behind him, threatened to sink, then caught on a woven tangle of roots. Good. He needed every advantage. He reached forward again, and this time his right hand touched grass. Real grass, solid, thick, wiry coastal grass. It didn't sink. Daniel pressed his palm into it, testing. The ground held. A wave of relief washed over him so sharply he almost sobbed. He dragged himself forward, inching until his chest reached the edge of the firmer ground. His elbows dug into the grass. His left knee followed, trembling. One more push, and his torso slid onto the patch completely. His legs, still half in the mud behind him, dangled for a terrifying moment. Another wave rolled in, washing over his shins. The cold shocked him backward into motion. He twisted onto his side, grabbed a handful of grass with both hands, and heaved. His left leg came free with a sloppy, sucking sound. His right one resisted. The mud clung to his soaked sock, pulling with greedy insistence. "No," he growled through his teeth. "Not now." Another wave hit, harder this time, climbing nearly to his knee. He yanked again. His right foot broke free so suddenly he rolled onto his back, gasping, both legs fully clear of the mud at last. He lay there for several seconds, chest heaving, eyes squeezed shut. The grass beneath him felt solid, real. Ridiculously safe compared to where he'd been. But he wasn't out yet. He forced himself to sit up. His feet were caked in mud, socks torn, one ankle swelling visibly. His hands shook uncontrollably. His elbows throbbed. His whole body felt hollowed out by effort. The water had reached the area he'd crawled across seconds earlier. It swallowed the abandoned boots completely, then lapped at the jacket, now half floating on the surface. If he'd waited any longer, he would have been underwater. Daniel pushed himself onto his hands and knees. His knee joints protested, stiff and hot under the cold. His swollen ankle made standing impossible for now, so he crawled, slow, painful, deliberate. Each push of his palm into the grass carried more weight than he wanted to admit he lacked. The boardwalk came back into view through the reeds. Still far, still higher ground, still his only chance. He tightened his jaw and dragged himself toward it. Crawling on solid grass was easier, but each movement still felt like pulling a tired, heavy body through mud. His shoulders trembled. His breath hissed in short bursts. He paused once, just long enough to look back. The spot where he had been trapped was now fully underwater. The tide moved over it without hesitation, as if the marsh had never held him. A shiver ran through him, not from cold, but from the sick realization of how close he had come to being part of that landscape permanently. "Not today," he whispered. He crawled again. The boardwalk was a miracle when he reached it, not just because it was safe, but because it was high enough that the tide couldn't claim it. The wooden boards were rough, weathered, and worn smooth by years of footsteps. He grabbed the lowest rail and pulled himself up until he was sitting on the edge, feet dangling in the cold air, body trembling from effort and adrenaline. He sat there, breathing hard, staring out at the marsh that had nearly killed him. The water continued to rise, erasing his struggle inch by inch. He wiped mud from his shaking hands and whispered, to no one, "I'm still here." It didn't feel triumphant. It felt fragile and real. He wasn't safe yet. He still had to get back to the car, still had to warm up, still had to deal with the swelling in his ankle. But he wasn't drowning in mud. Not anymore. For now, that was enough. For now, he simply breathed. Daniel stayed on the edge of the boardwalk longer than he intended. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, the kind that came from both exertion and fear refusing to drain out of the body. His ankle throbbed with a deep pulsing ache that spread warmth through the cold, muddy sock. His palms burned from scraping against coarse grass and splintered wood. But he was out of the mud, out of the tide's reach, alive. He repeated that to himself once, alive, then braced his hands against the boardwalk railing and forced his spine upright. His back protested, joints clicking down his spine like a zipper made of bone. But he managed to stand long enough to test his weight. The moment his bare right foot touched the wood, pain flared through the ankle. He nearly buckled. "Easy," he muttered, grabbing the railing again. The ankle wasn't broken. He knew that kind of pain. This was a sprain. Bad, swollen, angry, but functional if he respected it. Respecting it was the challenge. He looked ahead. The boardwalk stretched a few hundred yards back to the parking lot, twisting through reeds and shallow water. Normally it was a peaceful walk, but right now it felt like a mile-long tightrope. He wiped the mud from his fingers onto his pants, then reached into his backpack. The granola bar wrapper was slick with mud, but he pressed it open and took a small bite. His jaw felt tight, like the stress had locked it in place. The sugar helped. Not much, but enough to clear some of the fog from his head. He looked behind one last time, the tidal marsh spread out in muted shades of grey and brown, water sliding across the surface with casual ease. The spot where he had been trapped was now fully submerged. The boots he'd left behind were gone, either pulled under or drifting out of view. "Good riddance," he whispered. But the truth caught up with him immediately. He would need new boots. He would need to explain what had happened. He would need to tell Emily. He pushed the thought away. First things first, get back to the car. He placed one hand firmly on the railing and began to move. His left foot, still in a sock soaked with cold mud, found the boardwalk, gripping just enough to hold his balance. His right foot followed, resting lightly, avoiding pressure on the swollen joint. Step. Breathe. Step. Pause. Hold the rail. Step again. He moved slowly, but moving kept him warm. Warmer than sitting still and letting the cold wind stiffen his muscles further. His wet clothes were a constant reminder that hypothermia wasn't out of the question. Not extreme hypothermia, but the quiet kind, the kind that made thinking sluggish and fingers numb. He flexed his hands to keep them working. The wind picked up as he reached the first turn in the boardwalk, pushing across the marsh with enough force to make the wooden rail vibrate. He leaned into it, wincing as his ankle brushed the slats. Halfway. He wasn't sure how long it took him to reach the midpoint. The world narrowed to a rhythm. Rail, foot, foot, breath, pain, repeat. When he couldn't avoid the pressure on his right foot anymore, he adjusted his stride, walking slightly sideways like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. It wasn't graceful, but it worked. His breathing steadied. His mind sharpened. The parking lot came into view. He almost laughed. The sight of his car, a blue SUV sitting perfectly still, perfectly dry, looked unreal, as if it belonged to someone else's life. But then the wind pushed another spray of cold mist across his face, snapping him back to reality. He reached the ramp that led off the boardwalk and down to firm gravel. He held the railing, eased his weight down one step at a time, and let out a slow exhale when both feet were on solid ground. "Okay," he murmured. "You're not done, but you're close." The gravel bit into his bare socks, sending shock after shock through his cold feet. He nearly stumbled, but caught himself on a wooden post. He limped across the parking lot, leaving a messy trail of muddy footprints behind him. His breath fogged in front of him like small ghosts drifting away in the wind. When he reached the driver's door, his hands shook so badly he fumbled the keys twice. The metal clinked against the doorframe before he finally got it into the lock. He opened the door and sat inside with a heavy thud. Warmth. The car wasn't warm yet, but it blocked the wind. The air felt still, breathable. The faint smell of old coffee and pine-scented air freshener greeted him like an embrace. He sat for a moment with the door open, head bowed, letting the adrenaline drain slowly. Then he closed the door with a click that sounded louder than it should. His fingers were clumsy on the ignition. He turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. Warm air began to push through the vents, faint at first, then stronger. He held his hands in front of one vent, watching the mud dry and crack on his skin. A laugh, quiet, shaky, escaped him. "I'm really still here," he whispered. He shouldn't have been. He knew that in a way that hit deeper than logic. A few more minutes stuck in that mud. One more slip. One more wave. One more moment of hesitation. He pushed the thought down and focused on the present. He needed to change into something dry. He leaned to the back seat, grabbed the spare jacket and compression blanket he kept for emergencies, and pulled them forward. He wrapped the blanket around his legs and shoulders, feeling the warmth spread gradually. He opened his phone. No service still. But he could at least check the time. He'd been trapped far longer than he realized. When the warmth finally reached his fingers, he held the phone tighter. He needed to call Emily, but he didn't want to worry her while still in shock. He needed to drive home first, warm up, clean up, and think. He rested his head back against the seat. Outside, the tide continued to rise, covering the marsh in a slow, silvery sheet. He closed his eyes. Then, a sharp knock on the window jolted him upright. He turned. A park ranger stood outside the car, hand still raised from knocking, his face concerned, eyes scanning Daniel's mud-covered clothes and bare feet. Daniel's breath caught. He reached for the window switch with shaking fingers. The ranger leaned down as the glass lowered. "Sir," he said, voice firm but gentle. "Are you all right?" Daniel opened his mouth. The answer sat there, heavy and complicated. He swallowed. "I think I just had the closest call of my life." The ranger's eyes widened, then softened. "Let's get you warmed up," he said. "You're safe now." Daniel looked past him, toward the marsh, where the tide erased the last traces of what had happened. Safe. For the first time that day, the word felt real, and it felt earned. Daniel stared at the ranger for a long moment, not quite trusting that he was real. The man's uniform looked impossibly clean compared to Daniel's mud-soaked clothes. Water dripped from Daniel's socks onto the floor mat. His fingers shook against the steering wheel. The ranger seemed to notice all of it at once. "Mind if I open the door?" he asked. Daniel nodded. The ranger pulled the door wide, letting cold air back into the car. He crouched down so they were eye to eye. "My name's Carter," he said. "I was doing a patrol loop and saw your car covered in mud from the knees down. That usually means something went wrong. You want to tell me what happened?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words didn't come easily. The story felt too big, too tangled, and too close. "I got stuck," he finally whispered. Carter waited. "In the mud," Daniel added. "Out there. The tide almost—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Carter's expression didn't change. He didn't question it or show disbelief. Instead, he looked slowly toward the marsh, eyes narrowing as if trying to picture the scene. "That can be serious," he said. "Very serious." Then he looked back at Daniel. "You're lucky you got out." Daniel let out a low, humorless laugh. "I know." Carter stood up. "Do you mind if I check you for injuries? You're shaking pretty hard." Daniel nodded again. The ranger stepped closer and helped Daniel turn slightly in the seat so he could look at the ankle. He pressed gently around the swelling, asking questions in a calm, controlled voice. "Sharp pain or dull?" "Dull," Daniel said. "Radiates anywhere." "Just annoying, not sharp." "That's good. Likely a sprain." Carter paused. "Any dizziness?" "No, just tired." "And your breathing? Feels normal?" Daniel nodded, though normal wasn't the word he'd use. His chest was heavy, and every inhale reminded him of that moment when the tide brushed his boots. Carter stepped back. "I want you to rest for a minute, then I'll help you walk to my truck. We have a small warming kit and some clean supplies. You got cold enough for it to be dangerous." Daniel swallowed. "I thought—" He stopped. He didn't want to say it out loud. Carter lowered his voice. "You thought you weren't getting out?" Daniel looked down at his mud-coated hands. "Yes." The ranger didn't rush him. He didn't offer cliches or reassurance. He simply stood nearby, giving Daniel space to breathe. A minute passed, then another. Finally, Daniel exhaled shakily and nodded. "All right, I can walk." "Lean on me if you need it," Carter said. Daniel opened the car door wider, the cold air wrapping around him like an unfinished warning. His feet hit the gravel with a sting that shot up his legs. He steadied himself on the door, then put one hand on Carter's arm. "You okay?" Carter asked. "Yeah," Daniel said, "just sore." They walked slowly, painfully, across the parking lot. Every step made Daniel's ankle pulse. His shoulders ached. His back felt like it had been hammered. Carter supported him steadily without hovering. When they reached the ranger truck, he opened the passenger door and helped Daniel sit inside. The heater was already running. Warm, dry air hit Daniel's face, and he almost groaned with relief. Carter handed him a foil-lined warming blanket. "Wrap this around your legs. It'll help get your temperature back up." Daniel did, feeling the warmth bloom gradually under the silver material. Carter passed him a bottle of water and a small packet of electrolyte powder. "Slow sips," he said. "You lost a lot of energy out there." Daniel nodded, taking a careful drink. For a while they sat in silence. Only the ticking of the heater and Daniel's shaky breathing filled the space. Finally, Carter spoke. "People underestimate this place. They think the boardwalk means the marsh is tame. But tidal mud, it can lock you in before you realize what's happening." Daniel let out a long breath. "I should have known better." "Knowing better doesn't always stop us," Carter said. "We want one good photo, one better angle, one step that feels safe." Daniel stared at his hands again. "My daughter offered to come with me," he said quietly. "I told her I didn't need help." Carter watched him closely. "That's a hard one." "She worries," Daniel said, "and I hate feeling like I'm fragile." "You're not fragile," Carter said simply. "You survived something most people don't." Silence filled the truck again. The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. Not praise, not comfort, just truth. He looked out the window at the marsh. The tide had overtaken the area completely now. The whole landscape shimmered with cold, shallow water. Not a single piece of ground was visible where he had been trapped. If he were still there, he wouldn't be breathing. His throat tightened at the thought. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for checking on me." Carter nodded. "It's my job, but I'm glad I got here when I did." Daniel gave a weak smile. "So am I." After another minute, Carter reached for his radio. "I need to log this as a safety incident. Standard procedure. No ambulance unless you want one." "I don't," Daniel said quickly. "I just want to go home." "You can," Carter said, "but take it slow and call someone when you get there." Daniel knew exactly who he needed to call. Emily. The hardest part wasn't the conversation itself. It was admitting he wasn't invincible anymore. He leaned back in the seat, eyes closing as the warmth soaked into his clothes. "Do you need anything else?" Carter asked. Daniel shook his head. "Just a little more time." The ranger nodded. Daniel rested his hands on the blanket, breathing deeply. The fear was fading, replaced by something quieter, heavier, more reflective. He thought about the mud pulling at him, the water rising, the moment his boot disappeared, the way the tide didn't care whether he lived or died. He had always thought danger belonged to younger men, to climbers, to hunters, to people who chased risk. But danger lived everywhere, even in places he loved, especially there. When he finally opened his eyes, his breathing had steadied. "I can drive," he said, "as long as I take it slow." Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll follow you out to make sure you get past the rough patch in the road." Daniel smiled softly. "Thank you." They stepped out of the truck together. The wind hit Daniel's face, cold but no longer threatening. He walked slowly to his own car, blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. He got in, closed the door, and took a long breath. The tide had risen high enough to touch the edge of the parking lot. He put the key in the ignition. As he pulled away, he glanced once more at the marsh. The ocean was calm, indifferent, vast. And Daniel, for the first time in years, felt both very small and very lucky. 2 days later, Daniel stood at the edge of his driveway, watching the grey sky without really seeing it. His ankle was wrapped, his clothes were clean, and his body was mostly recovered. But his mind was still out there in the marsh, half buried in the cold mud. Emily had driven over the same night he called. She didn't yell. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just listened, eyes bright, hands wrapped around a mug of tea as he described the moment the tide touched his boots. "You could have died, Dad," she'd whispered. "I know," he had replied. And this time, he truly did. Age hadn't given him immunity. It had only given him perspective. The line between a nice day out and the day everything ends was thinner than he'd ever wanted to believe. A wrong step, a stubborn decision, one more minute spent trying to get a better angle for a photograph, and the story would have ended differently. Now, when he thought about the marsh, he didn't feel anger. He felt respect, sharp, clear respect, and a quiet understanding that survival at his age wasn't just about strength. It was about knowing when a familiar place had become dangerous, and admitting that he was no longer the same man who walked into it years ago. Sometimes, the dangers we survive at this age remind us of the things we feared as children. Tell me, what memory from your childhood still visits you on quiet nights?